The weight of the stone was nothing compared to the burden she carried in her heart. Grace Keller stumbled forward, her boots catching on the uneven ground of the Wyoming Territory, the smooth river rock slipping from her grasp as she fell. The year was 1878, and she was alone, determined to build a home from nothing but her own two hands and the wild landscape around her. The rock struck the ground with a thud, followed by her knees hitting the dirt. Her palms scraped against the rough earth, but she bit back her cry. No one would hear it anyway, not out here 3 miles from the nearest settlement. Whoa there! A deep voice called from somewhere behind her. "That's no way to treat those stones, madam." Grace turned her head, squinting against the harsh summer sun. A tall figure approached on horseback, silhouetted against the blue sky. As he drew closer, she could make out his features' strong jawline, weathered skin, a face both kind and cautious beneath a worn leather hat. "I don't recall asking for an audience," Grace replied, pushing herself to her feet and dusting off her hands on her already soiled skirt. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins, falling in waves around her face. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his chestnut mare to a nearby scrub oak. "Didn't say you did, just passing through when I saw you fall." He extended his hand. "Vaughn Ellers, most folks call me Vaughn." Grace ignored his outstretched hand. "I'm perfectly capable of carrying my own stones, Mr. Ellers." "Never suggested otherwise, Miss." "Keller, Grace Keller." Vaughn nodded slowly, eyes taking in the scattered stones, the crude markings for a foundation, the lone wagon with a canvas cover that served as her only shelter. "Building something, Miss Keller." "A house," she said, bending to retrieve the fallen stone. "My house." Vaughn pushed back his hat, revealing eyes the color of a summer storm. "Alone," Grace straightened her spine. "Is there a law against it?" A smile tugged at his lips. "No, madam." "But there might be some physics working against you." He gestured to the stone she was struggling to lift again. "Mind if I help? Just with the carrying, you can do the rest." Grace opened her mouth to refuse, but the truth was her back ached and her hands were raw. She'd been at this for weeks, making painfully slow progress. "Fine," she said finally, "but I'll be laying every stone myself." Vaughn removed his leather gloves and tucked them into his belt. "Wouldn't have it any other way." That afternoon they worked in near silence. Grace marked where she wanted the stones, and Vaughn carried them from the pile by the creek to where she worked. The sun beat down mercilessly, but neither complained. "You planning on staying out here long?" Vaughn asked finally, setting down a particularly large stone. Grace wiped the sweat from her brow. "Forever if I have my way." "That's a mighty long time to be alone." "I'm not alone," she said sharply. "I have myself." Vaughn studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough, still wouldn't hurt to have a neighbor check in from time to time." "Winters get harsh out here." "I survived last winter just fine. In that wagon." Vaughn looked skeptical. Grace stood, placing her hands on her hips. "Mr. Ellers, I appreciate the help with the stones, but I don't need your concern or your judgment." Vaughn held up his hands in surrender. "No judgment here, just admiration, truth be told." He glanced at the sky, noting the position of the sun. "It'll be dark soon. I should head back to town." Grace nodded, suddenly aware of how much progress they'd made together, more than she could have accomplished in 3 days on her own. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. It had been a long time since she'd had reason to thank anyone. "My pleasure, Miss Keller." Vaughn untied his horse, swinging easily into the saddle. "I ride this way most days, checking on the north pasture. Wouldn't be any trouble to stop by tomorrow if you wanted more help with those stones." Grace should have refused. She'd made it this far on her own, after all. But there was something about Vaughn Ellers, something in the way he hadn't questioned her right to be there, to build something of her own. "If you're passing by anyway," she said finally. Vaughn tipped his hat. "Until tomorrow, then." As he rode away, Grace surveyed her progress. For the first time in months, she felt something like hope taking root alongside her foundation. True to his word, Vaughn returned the next day and the day after that. Each morning, Grace would wake at dawn and begin working, and sometime before noon, she would hear the approach of hoofbeats. She found herself listening for them, though she would never admit it. On the fifth day, Vaughn arrived with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "What's that?" Grace asked, wiping mortar from her hands. "Thought you might be running low on supplies." He unwrapped the bundle, revealing salt pork, coffee beans, cornmeal, and a small jar of honey. "Miller at the general store owed me a favor." Grace stared at the provisions. It had been weeks since she'd had anything but the dried beans and hardtack she'd brought with her. "I can't accept this." "Sure you can." Vaughn set the bundle on her makeshift table. "Consider it payment for letting me help. Always did enjoy building things." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Why are you really here, Mr. Ellers? Day after day, what do you want?" Vaughn looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Nothing, Miss Keller, just being neighborly." "Neighborly," she repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "I've met enough neighborly men to know there's usually a price." Understanding dawned in Vaughn's eyes. "I'm not that kind of man, Miss Keller, I give you my word." The word of a stranger. "For now," he nodded to the foundation. "Looks like we could finish the base today if we push." Grace studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Let's get to work then." As they worked, Grace found herself opening up bit by bit. She told him about growing up in Boston, about losing her parents to fever, about the uncle who'd taken her in and taken liberties. "So I ran," she said simply, fitting a stone into place. "Worked my way west, saved every penny, bought this land." Vaughn listened without interruption, his hands never ceasing their work. When she finished, he said, "You're the bravest person I've ever met." Grace laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. "Brave or foolish?" "There's a fine line between the two," Vaughn said with a smile. "My pa used to say the best kind of life walks that line." "And what about you?" Grace asked, realizing she knew almost nothing about him. "What brought you to Wyoming?" Vaughn set down another stone before answering. "War, couldn't go back to Virginia afterward, too many ghosts." He flexed his left hand, and Grace noticed for the first time the jagged scar that ran from his wrist to his knuckles. "Worked cattle drives for a few years, saved enough to buy my spread about 10 miles east of here." "You fought for the Confederacy," Grace said. It wasn't a question. Vaughn met her gaze. "Yes, madam. I was 17, full of piss and vinegar and bad ideas, paid for them too." He gestured to his leg, and Grace realized he walked with a slight limp she'd never noticed. "But that's not who I am anymore." Grace nodded slowly. "I suppose we're all trying to outrun something." They worked until dusk, and when they finished the foundation, Vaughn helped Grace build a small fire. They shared a simple meal of salt pork and cornbread, watching as stars appeared one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. "What will you do once the house is built?" Vaughn asked. Grace looked at the foundation, solid and real in the firelight. "Plant a garden, get some chickens, maybe a cow." She smiled. "Live, sounds like a fine plan." Vaughn's voice was soft in the darkness. When he left that night, Grace watched him go, a strange ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the day's labor. Summer stretched into autumn, and the walls of Grace's house rose stone by stone. Vaughn came every day now, no longer pretending it was on his way to somewhere else. They developed a rhythm, working together as if they'd been doing it for years. One afternoon, as rain threatened on the horizon, Vaughn paused in his work. "Grace," he said the first time he'd used her given name, "there's a dance in town on Saturday. Harvest celebration, I thought." "That is, if you wanted." Grace froze, a stone in her hands. "Are you asking me to accompany you?" "I am." Vaughn looked nervous, a man who faced down rustlers and renegades suddenly unsure. "But if you'd rather not, yes," Grace said, surprising herself. "I'd like that." The smile that broke across Vaughn's face made her heart skip. "I'll come by at sunset on Saturday, then." As promised, Vaughn arrived at sunset on Saturday, riding a freshly groomed horse and wearing a clean shirt and his best hat. Grace had spent the day washing her hair and mending her one good dress, a blue cotton that had seen better days but still held its color. "You look beautiful," Vaughn said when she emerged from her wagon. Grace felt her cheeks warm. You clean up well yourself, Mr. Ellers. He helped her onto his horse, settling her in front of him in the saddle. The ride to town took nearly an hour, but Grace barely noticed the time passing, too aware of Vaughn's steady presence behind her, his arms on either side as he held the reins. The town hall was strung with lanterns, and a small band played lively tunes as couples whirled around the wooden floor. Grace hesitated at the entrance, suddenly conscious of her worn dress and rough hands. These were not her people. "We don't have to stay," Vaughn said quietly, sensing her discomfort. Grace squared her shoulders. "No, I want to." They entered together, and Grace felt the curious stares of the townspeople. She heard whispers about the woman building a house alone, about the widowed rancher who visited her daily. "Ignore them," Vaughn murmured, guiding her toward the refreshment table. Small towns run on gossip. Grace accepted a cup of punch, surveying the room. "Is that what they think? That we're involved? Would that be so terrible?" Vaughn asked, his eyes searching hers. Before Grace could answer, the band struck up a waltz and Vaughn extended his hand. "May I have this dance?" Grace hesitated, then placed her hand in his. "I should warn you, it's been years since I've danced." "Just follow my lead," Vaughn said, drawing her onto the floor. His hand was warm at her waist, steadying her as they moved in time with the music. Grace had forgotten the simple joy of dancing, of moving in harmony with another person. Vaughn guided her confidently, his eyes never leaving hers, and for the first time in years Grace felt truly seen. When the music ended, neither moved away. "Grace," Vaughn said softly, "I need to tell you something." A commotion at the door interrupted him. A young boy burst in, out of breath. "Fire! Rollins' barn is burning!" The room erupted in activity, men grabbing their hats and rushing for the door. Vaughn squeezed Grace's hand. "Wait here, I'll be back." Grace watched him go, joining the line of men passing buckets from the town well to the burning barn. She stood for a moment, feeling useless, then hitched up her skirts and joined the line herself, ignoring the startled looks from the other women. For hours they fought the fire, and when it was finally extinguished, everyone was soot-stained and exhausted. The Rollins family had lost their barn, but their home and livestock were saved. In the gray light of dawn, Vaughn found Grace sitting on the steps of the town hall, her blue dress ruined, her face streaked with soot. "You should have stayed inside," he said, settling beside her. Grace gave him a tired smile. "That's not who I am," Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "No, it's not." They rode back to Grace's homestead in comfortable silence, both too exhausted for conversation. When they arrived, Vaughn helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering at her waist. "What were you going to tell me?" Grace asked, remembering his interrupted words at the dance. Vaughn looked at her for a long moment. "That I'm falling in love with you, Grace Keller." Grace's breath caught. She'd known somehow, but hearing the words aloud made them real and terrifying. "Vaughn, you don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know." He turned to go, but Grace caught his hand. "Wait." When he faced her again, Grace did the bravest thing she'd done since leaving Boston. She stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief, tentative, but when she pulled away, Vaughn's eyes were shining. "I'm not ready to say it back," Grace admitted. "But I'm not asking you to leave either." Vaughn smiled, touching her cheek gently. "That's more than enough for now." As autumn deepened, so did their connection. The walls of Grace's house grew higher, and with them, her trust in Vaughn. He never pressed for more than she was ready to give, content with stolen kisses and shared meals by the fire. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Vaughn said casually, "Winter's coming. That wagon won't keep you warm when the snow flies." Grace looked at the half-finished house. "It won't be ready in time." "There's room at my place," Vaughn said, keeping his voice neutral. "A spare bedroom just until spring." Grace stiffened. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity, Grace, it's concern." Vaughn took her hand. "Last winter was mild, this one won't be. Ask anyone." "And what would people say? A single woman living under your roof? They can say what they like. I know the truth, and so do you." He squeezed her hand. But if you're worried about appearances, there's another option. Grace's heart raced. What's that? Marry me. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Grace stared at him. Vaughn, not because of winter or what people might say. He turned to face her fully. Because I love you, Grace, because these past months have been the best of my life. Because I want to build something with you, not just this house, but a life. Tears welled in Grace's eyes. I've been on my own for so long. I know, and you could have stayed that way, built all this yourself. He gestured to the stone walls rising around them. But you let me help. You let me in. I'm afraid, Grace admitted, her voice small. Of what? Of needing someone, of losing myself. Vaughn cupped her face in his hands. Grace Keller, you're the strongest person I know. No one could make you lose yourself, least of all me. I don't want to change you, I just want to love you. Grace looked at the house they'd built together, stone by stone. Then she looked at Vaughn, at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Vaughn repeated, disbelieving. Grace smiled through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you. They were married 2 weeks later in the town church, a simple ceremony with few guests. Grace wore a new dress of deep green, bought with money from the sale of her wagon. Vaughn wore a clean black suit, his hair trimmed and his face freshly shaved. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Grace felt not the constriction she had feared, but a profound sense of rightness, as if the final stone had been laid in her foundation. They spent the winter at Vaughn's ranch, a modest but comfortable place with a sturdy barn and good grazing land. In the evenings, they would plan additions to Grace's house, their house now, for when spring came and they could resume building. I want a big kitchen, Grace said one night, sketching on a piece of paper at the table, with windows that face east for the morning light. Vaughn watched her, a smile playing on his lips, and a porch that wraps around for summer evenings. And a room for Grace stopped, a blush rising to her cheeks. For, Vaughn prompted, for children, Grace said softly. Someday. Vaughn's face lit up. He crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. I'd like that very much. Winter passed in a haze of contentment, and when the first signs of spring appeared, they returned to Grace's homestead. The stone walls had weathered well, and they set to work immediately, determined to finish before summer's end. Word spread about the house building, and neighbors began to stop by bringing food, offering help, curious about the Eastern woman and her Confederate husband who were building a life stone by stone. Grace, who had once valued her solitude above all else, found herself enjoying these visits. The women taught her to preserve vegetables and make soap. The men helped Vaughn raise the heavy roof beams and dig a proper well. By midsummer, the house was taking its final shape. Grace stood in what would be her kitchen, running her hands over the smooth stone walls. Penny for your thoughts, Vaughn said, coming in from setting fence posts. Grace turned to him, her face radiant. I was just thinking how different this is from what I imagined. The house, everything. She gestured around them. I came here to be alone, to prove I didn't need anyone. And now, Vaughn prompted, coming to stand beside her. Grace took his hand and placed it on her abdomen, still flat but holding a precious secret. Now we're going to need that extra room sooner than I thought. Vaughn's eyes widened. Grace, are you saying? She nodded, a smile breaking across her face. In winter, around Christmas, I think. Vaughn let out a whoop of joy that must have been heard clear to town. He lifted Grace off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her gently back down. A baby, he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Our baby. Are you happy? Grace asked, suddenly unsure. Vaughn looked at her as if she'd asked if the sky was blue. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Grace, I've never felt anything like this. They worked with renewed purpose after that, determined to finish the house before the baby came. The roof went on, the floors were laid, glass windows were installed, a luxury Grace insisted on, wanting their child to wake to sunshine. In October, with the first snow dusting the mountains, they moved in. The house was simple but solid, with 3 rooms downstairs and 2 above. stone walls thick enough to keep out the fiercest Wyoming winter winds. That first night they sat before the hearth, watching flames dance in the fireplace Vaughn had built with his own hands. "Do you remember when we met?" Vaughn asked, his arm around Grace's shoulders. Grace laughed, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "How could I forget? I fell flat on my face carrying a stone too heavy for me. And I thought, who is this stubborn woman trying to build a house all by herself? And I thought, who is this presumptuous cowboy thinking I need his help?" Vaughn kissed her temple. "Turns out we both needed each other." Grace leaned into him, feeling their child kick beneath her hand. "Turns out we did." Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, but inside the stone house, built by a woman who sought independence, and a man who found his future in helping her lay each stone, there was only warmth and love, and the promise of a life neither had dared to imagine. On Christmas Eve, with a blizzard raging outside, Grace went into labor. Vaughn sent their nearest neighbor for the midwife, but the snow was too deep, the wind too fierce. They would have to manage alone. "I'm scared," Grace admitted, gripping Vaughn's hand as another contraction washed over her. "I know, love, but you can do this." Vaughn's voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed his fear. "You built a house from nothing. You can bring our child into the world." Through the long night, Grace labored, her strength tested as never before. Vaughn stayed by her side, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement, praying silently to a God he'd not spoken to since the war. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, their daughter entered the world, her lusty cries filling the stone house. "She has your spirit," Vaughn said, tears streaming unchecked down his face as he placed the swaddled infant in Grace's arms. Grace looked down at their daughter, at the tiny fingers and dark hair, and felt her heart expand beyond measure. "Victoria," she said softly. "We'll call her Victoria." "For victory," Vaughn agreed, sitting beside them on the bed. "Because that's what she is, what you are, a victory over everything that tried to break you." Grace leaned against him, exhausted but radiant. "What we built together, it's stronger than anything I could have made alone." "That's what love does," Vaughn said, his finger caught in his daughter's tiny grip. "It doesn't make us weaker, it makes us unbreakable." As the sun rose higher, casting golden light through the windows of the house they'd built stone by stone, Grace looked at her husband and daughter and knew she had found her true foundation. Years passed, and the house grew along with their family. A son joined Victoria 2 years later, and another daughter 2 years after that. The land around the house flourished, an orchard to the west, vegetable gardens to the south, pastures with cattle and horses stretching to the horizon. On warm summer evenings, they would sit on the porch Vaughn had built, watching their children play in the yard, listening to the distant lowing of cattle and the wind in the cottonwoods. "Do you ever regret it?" Vaughn asked one such evening as they watched Victoria, now 10, teaching her younger siblings a game involving pebbles and a drawn circle. "Regret what?" Grace asked, her hand finding his in the gathering dusk. "Letting me help. Sharing your dream." Grace smiled, thinking of the day she'd fallen carrying stones too heavy for one person. "Never, not for a single moment." Vaughn squeezed her hand. "Me neither." The stone house stood solid on the Wyoming plain, a testament to one woman's determination and the love that had laid its foundation, stone by stone, beside her.